USA Today is reporting today that Joe Biden is indeed planning on a preemptive pardon for Anthony Fauci. And that is so interesting. Why in the world would the doctor who led the charge against COVID, why would he need a preemptive pardon? That's quite a thing to give somebody a preemptive pardon. Hey, you're definitely going to get prosecuted for crimes, so I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to you. Joining me now to talk about that and many, many other things is Hans Mahncke. He is an author of the book Swiftboating America, amongst other things. Hey, Hans, why would Fauci need a pardon?
I think, first of all, because the statute of limitations on his crimes has not expired. There's this 5-year limit when if you don't bring charges within 5 years, you can't bring them anymore. Well, most of the stuff that Fauci did in 2020, well, that's still within 5 years. So I think that's probably the biggest concern there.
Okay, what did he do? What crimes?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of people focus on these exchanges he had with Rand Paul in the Senate when he was asked about gain of function. Did you do gain of function and so on? I don't think that qualifies. I mean, yes, colloquially it does. And of course he lied and so on. But we all know how he worms his way around. And if you watch those clips very carefully, and there's several because he did that over and over, he's always very careful to somehow, weasel his way out with words. So I don't think it's that. I think the actual crimes that Fauci committed have to do with the cover-up of COVID's origin, which he was made aware of in January of 2020. And that's not a problem in and of itself. It's the fact that the cover-up that Fauci orchestrated, he began the cover-up, he ran the whole thing. That then caused all these follow-on effects in terms of the response. So everything we saw in terms of the response, with the masks and the lockdowns and the mandates and things like contact tracing and so on, all of that would have been very different if Fauci had been truthful about the fact that this came out of a lab. And the reason is very simple. Normally, all these responses are based on the idea that these viruses come from nature. But viruses that come from nature are not pre-adapted to infect humans. It takes time. So it actually helps to contact trace because then you can cut it off at that point when you found someone, when you traced them and their contacts. Well, in this case, none of that mattered because the lab had perfected the virus for human infection. It was like a wildfire. That's what they set out to do. That was the whole purpose of it. So I think that particular lie, that's the problem. And of course, he didn't only lie to the public about it. I think for in terms of legal consequences, and I have a feeling this is what they're really thinking about, Biden's people there, is Fauci lied to the COVID task force. Remember, Trump had this COVID task force, and Fauci was an original member back in January of 2020. And the task force, those were the people who in the White House were discussing the response. And he lied to them because he didn't tell them about what he knew about the origin. And all the other disasters flowed from that.
Okay, so why did he lie, Hans? What was the angle? I always thought this was so odd that he would lie because so many people lied. I mean, I remember like it was yesterday, Central Intelligence Agency actually was paid to change their story on the origins of this whole thing. Why? Why not just come out and say it was a lab in Wuhan studying icky stuff and it got out? Why the lie?
The short version is because Fauci funded that lab. But of course, if you know China and know how things work there and so on, they have a lot of money. It's not the fact that they needed Fauci's money. It's the fact that he funded it, gave the lab NIAID stamp of approval. This is hugely important. All the papers that the lab put out at the bottom, they always wrote sponsored by NIAID. This is such a huge thing. And with that opened all these other doors. Suddenly they were able to access advanced Western biotechnology and all these other things that come with that. So in other words, Fauci enabled the lab. He made the lab what it is. So that's the one side of it. Of course, the other side are these experiments themselves. So you'll recall that there was a moratorium in the United States on gain of function. It was decided this is too dangerous. We can't do this. Well, what did Fauci do? He took those experiments and sent them off to China, to the Wuhan lab. So a combination of those things is probably why he decided he needed to cover up the true origin of this.
Somebody who definitely needs a pardon, but of course she got a Presidential Medal of Freedom, was one Hillary Rodham Clinton. And look, everyone knows the Russian hoax stuff was a hoax now, but a lot of people forget that that hoax began with Hillary, and this is your particular cup of tea.
It is. It is also something very frustrating when you think about it. Now we laugh about, oh, she got a medal or whatever. It's a hugely serious and hugely bad thing that she did. She had this plan to call her opponent a Russian agent. I mean, we all just got to zoom out here and think about that. You call your opponent, the Republican nominee for president, a Russian agent. Now, she, of course, intended it as a smear campaign with two goals. I mean, on the one hand, to distract from her own, email scandal. On the other hand, to dirty up Trump. But the consequences of doing that were so massive. I mean, just think about Trump's hands being tied for his entire 4 years. Anytime he mentioned Russia, or anytime he wanted to meet Putin, or anytime he said anything about any of those things, Ukraine-Russia relations, anything at all, boom, the media exploded. He couldn't do anything. So they basically criminalized diplomacy, especially pertaining to Russia. And we see the effects now, with the Ukraine war and many, many other things, bifurcation of the world order, and so on and so forth. All of that started with Hillary Clinton's Russia hoax. So it wasn't just ordinary kind of smear that you have in the campaign season. It was so much worse than that. And of course, the other part of it is that she fabricated, or her operatives fabricated evidence, literally, not like just made it up or whatever. Literally, just fabricated it in terms of this Alpha Bank trail, where they fabricated evidence of a IT connection between Trump and Putin and all this kind of stuff. Okay, fabricate stuff, fine. But then they took that stuff and gave it to the FBI because they wanted to trigger an investigation of their opponent. I mean, just think of all those things. Just zoom out and just think about that. And the fact that she now got this medal, which is, by the way, the highest civilian honor anyone can get, is just beyond belief.
Speaking of the FBI, they were involved, and they still are involved in covering this whole thing up, aren't they?
They certainly are. We have some news in terms of, they just released, after a long, back and forth. They always try and hold on to all these documents for as long as possible. So like 8 years on, it's been 8 years, and they finally released the document with which they opened the investigation into Donald Trump, the sitting president. That's often forgotten. It wasn't just like an investigation of his campaign or, these other characters, whatever. All of that was made up. All of that was fake. But it's even worse than that. They went after Donald Trump himself. They opened an investigation into him personally. Now, most of that is redacted. Now, I'd like to know what it says. How dare they open an investigation into the president? I mean, there's so many problems with that. I mean, the first one is, they're saying they're doing it on national security grounds. Well, where does their power come from? Who decides those things? Well, the president does. The FBI is basically, derives its powers from the president. He's the only, according to the Constitution, the only elected person in the entire executive branch. Everything, flows from the president. So what were they doing? Now, of course, we know what they were doing. They were trying to take him down. And the particular point of opening that investigation into Trump is to get a special counsel appointed. That was really what it was about, because Trump's own DOJ, when I say own, we all know this, it was full of these, Clinton and Obama holdovers and so on. But if you have the president himself being investigated by his own DOJ, well, that calls for a special counsel. So that's why they did that. And that's how we got Mueller.
Hans, of course, we're sending another $500 million to Ukraine, which is insane. But you just did a piece comparing Ukraine to Vietnam. What's going on?
It was, I love Vietnam. I love visiting there. I hadn't been for a long time, so I went back recently, stayed for quite a while. Just love traveling around the country. It's just so wonderful, especially the people. And, you meet everyone, and they love Americans, which is, kind of weird in a way, but it's very genuine. And what just struck me is all the same mistakes that were made. Vietnam and the U.S. should have never had a war. Just, should have never done. And, the piece explains this in far more detail. But if you think about it, what's the U.S. doing in Ukraine? And then you come up with all these kind of parallels, and it all really culminated. There's a museum in Saigon where basically the Vietnamese are displaying all the left behind equipment that the Americans left behind. And they do it without commentary. It speaks for itself. It's so powerful. And you're there and you're thinking, this was all so totally senseless. And yet the same thing is happening in Ukraine. Essentially, these are, in Vietnam, they had old beef to do with French colonialism and all that kind of stuff going back 100 plus years. Well, Ukrainians and Russians have old beef. Ukraine is a country that's basically split along language lines, is partly Russian and partly Ukrainian. There are regional and local problems. Every time the U.S. has decided to get involved in one of those issues, it hasn't ended well. And so, just going to Vietnam and seeing it, just really, that hit home again.
Yeah. Hans, appreciate you very much, my friend. Come back soon. I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.